Thank you for joining me today. I'm an English teacher and the Humanities Department head in a school in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. And BC is changing how secondary schools report out on learning in the 2023-2024 school year. We're moving from a grades and percentage-based reporting system to a proficiency-based one. Because of this, we've done a lot of work around assessment at my school. We've looked at ways to take what we're already doing and adapt it. We've discussed how to change our practices to include more descriptive feedback. And we've looked at a variety of different ways to collect and record data. Today, I'm going to share some of my practices. A quick note, I teach Humanities 8 and English 10 Literary Studies and Creative Writing this semester, so my examples will be from those two classes. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly consider some of the terms we'll be using. Traditionally, much of the assessment that teachers were expected to do was assessment of learning. Yes, we were supposed to help students improve, but that was seen as separate from assessment. We measured where they were at a particular moment in time and reported on that. Assessment for learning is much more robust and I believe better for the students. In essence, it recognizes where students are right now in their learning and gives them advice on what they should do next to move their learning forward. Assessment of learning is looking at the end result, whereas assessment for learning is looking more at the process. Let's start with assessment for learning. So feedback and grades aren't really the same thing. Grades are not helpful in terms of moving learning forward. They're assessment of learning, they're not assessment for learning. And if the goal of education is learning, which I think it is for all of us, then we need to focus our limited time and attention on building learning for students. It's true that effective feedback can take longer assignment for assignment, but it moves learning forward in a way that grades or percentages can't do. So this graphic is from the Educational Leadership magazine, and I found it on John Hattie's Visible Learning website. He's an educational researcher from Australia that looked at more than 800 meta-studies to determine what has a significant impact on students' learning, and effective feedback was one of those things. These are the four most significant quotes, the ones that stand out for me from this graphic. And the first one is from Grant Wiggins, who was one of the Understanding by Design guys, and also wrote Educative Assessment and Assessing Student Performance. And he points out that feedback is information about how we are doing in relation to the learning target. The second key quote is sort of related to that. This is Susan Brookhart, who wrote Assessment and Grading in Classrooms and Using Feedback to Improve Learning. And she points out that learners need to know the learning target in order to benefit from the feedback. So students need to know what they're aiming towards in order to benefit from information about how well they're getting there. Jan Chapuis, who wrote Classroom Assessment for Student Learning, points out that effective feedback is given when learners can act on it. So if we're going to put the time into giving descriptive feedback, students need the opportunity to actually apply it in some way, either to the same assignment or to a future one. And then the last one is that from Peter Johnston, who wrote Choice Words and Opening Minds Using Language to Change Minds. And he says that when part of the feedback is a grade, learners generally only look at the grade. So it's important to keep our assessment for learning separate from giving a grade or a percentage. I tried to come up with an effective acronym for what makes for effective feedback, and feedback is so important. It's probably not my best work, but I hope it'll stick in your minds. Good feedback is student-focused and strength-based. It lists specific steps that the learner can take to improve, and it has a significant impact on the learning. And I'm going to go over each of these with an example on the next few slides. So this is an argumentative essay that was written by one of my grade 8 students. We'd spent a significant amount of time going over how to choose reliable sources and conduct research, how to use evidence to support your arguments, etc. I'm not going to read it out. I want to focus on the methods of assessment and feedback, but it is here if you would like to pause the video and read it. Before I get into descriptive feedback, here are two traditional assessment of learning responses. The first one, thoughtful and well organized, B or 83% or proficient. It gives a grade, percent, or competency level, but there's not much information there, and it doesn't meet any of the 4 S's. The rubric provides more information about where the student is, but doesn't provide specific steps to move forward. It's not really student-centered because the same rubric is used for all students, but it could maybe be considered somewhat strengths-based, but it doesn't focus on significant improvements. It assesses everything. This is assessment for learning, specifically descriptive feedback that helps the learner improve in her writing. And I'll break it down on the next few slides. Here's the feedback. The thesis of your essay is clear and thought-provoking, and you provide support for it throughout your essay. You are clearly very passionate about the topic. You have a lot of information in your introduction. Some of it is key to understanding the arguments you're going to make. Some of it distracts from your argument. Shortening your hook would help your reader get to your points more quickly, making them want to read more. Some of your body paragraphs are directly related to your thesis, particularly the one on guaranteeing that all children have access to the same outcomes, and the one on how the cost keeps otherwise intelligent citizens from being able to go on to post-secondary education. Others, such as the one that begins, "What does it mean to be well educated?" and the one that begins, "How important is education?" are providing extra information that isn't focused on proving your thesis. To make your essay more persuasive, direct everything in it to proving the overall argument. Remember that when you include quotes and examples from your research to help support your main ideas, you need to put it in quotation marks. Otherwise, it is plagiarism. Assessment for learning follows these basic steps. The first one, the student-centered, is something that you keep in mind but isn't really part of the format of the feedback, or rather it guides the feedback as a whole. But for the others, you start with areas of strength, describing what you've noticed about their learning. Then you describe areas for growth where they could improve the most. And then you give them specific tips for how to make those improvements. In the example that I just gave, N is a student who's really passionate about doing well. She asks a lot of questions about how she can improve. So I kept that in mind as I was giving her feedback, identifying a couple of key areas where she could improve. I started off with areas of strength regarding the thesis and the body paragraphs that are directly related to the thesis, and I identified specific paragraphs that met that sort of criteria. Then I identified 2 areas for growth and gave her steps to move her learning forward. The first one was the hook, the information in the introduction, and I suggested that shortening your hook would help your readers be more engaged, make them want to read more. And then the second one was that these other 2, again, I gave specific paragraphs so that she could identify which ones they were providing extra information that wasn't focused on proving the thesis, and that directing everything towards proving that argument makes the essay more persuasive. Giving feedback, assessment for learning like we were just showing, is useful for the student and it helps them move forward in their learning. But as teachers, we're also responsible for keeping records of learning. Although I've redacted the learners' names, these are semi-accurate percentages from 2 of the learners from my current English 10 Literary Studies and Creative Writing class. I say semi-accurate because I don't actually assess this way, so I had to look back at my assessments and figure out what their score would have been in the traditional records. This is a simplistic example. But traditionally, we've assessed individual assignments and then, in essence, put them into a bin. Assignments, tests, essays, journals, etc. And then each bin has a certain weight. I kept this one basic with just 2 bins, assignments and final essays written at the end of each unit. Assignments worth 20%, the essays worth 80%. And then I averaged out the marks to calculate each learner's grade. 72%, which is a C+ for learner 1, 61%, which is a C for learner 2. However, the averages don't really acknowledge the increase in learning that I can see from learner 1's essay scores, nor their increase from poetry analysis 1 to poetry analysis 2. And that's one of the problems that I see here. Another problem is just the problem that comes with averaging, even if you do it in separate bins. The person who earns 100% on one assignment, then 50% on the next, then 0 on the third, averages out at 50%. So does the person who earns 50% on all 3 assignments, and so does the one who started at 0%, went to 50%, and ended at 100%. As one of my colleagues asks frequently, which person do you want packing your parachute before you go skydiving? The one who started off at 100% but whose most recent try was at 0? The one who was 50% the whole time? Or the one who started at 0% but has now increased to 100% accuracy? So this is how I assess my grade 10 students now, by competency. You can see that, again, I'm doing a fairly limited sample, but I've got 5 competencies that I'm looking at here. The first, identifying literary elements and devices. The second, thinking critically and reflectively to explore ideas. The third, assessing information for diverse purposes from a variety of sources to inform writing. The fourth, express and support an opinion with evidence. And the fifth, use acknowledgments and citations to recognize intellectual property rights. So again, I've got the 2 learners. I've got the same assignments, but you can see that they are separated now into competency. So learner 1, who previously was at 72%, in terms of literary devices is at a low proficient, critical thinking proficient, accessing information from diverse sources is proficient, expressing and supporting an opinion with evidence is proficient, and citations is a low proficient. And I kind of hesitate on that one because you can see with the citations that they've moved from the first one being really low at an emerging level, and then at a high competence level, and then at a proficient level. But I haven't had a chance to see if they are able to sort of maintain that proficient level, which is why I've put it at low proficient. I would want to ideally look at another assignment or 2 to see if they are able to maintain that pattern. But when you look at that overall, they're in the proficient range. The low proficient range, so probably 75 to 80%, but definitely still a B. And it's a change from 72% in the previous example because I can look at the pattern here and I can see that the most recent evidence of learning tends to be more in the proficient range. Learner 2 is in literary devices at a low developing level, critical thinking developing, sources high developing, opinion high developing, and citations developing. So overall, they're about a developing level. So a C, which is 60 to 67%. So that one didn't change too much. It's maybe a little higher than the first example because I'm able to look for patterns rather than letting a bad mark overwhelm the grade. But they're pretty solidly in the developing range. I look for recent and repeating scores. The most recent demonstrates their growth, and students shouldn't be penalized because they take time to learn, which is one of the reasons why I don't like averaging. And the repeating pattern shows that they're consistently at this level. When I look at the data here, I can see that learner 1 has been improving over time, while learner 2 has mostly stayed at the same level. I can also see specifically what each student is struggling with or where they've improved. Learner 1, expressing and supporting an opinion has been a challenge for that person, while practice has helped them become more proficient in citations. Learner 2 clearly struggles with identifying literary elements and devices. There's a spike in accessing information for diverse purposes in the last assignment for Learner 2. So ideally, just like with the citations for Learner 1, I'd want to see if that was a one-off or if it actually demonstrates an increased understanding. To get to the competencies that I assess in my records, I start with learning targets. Well, I start with identifying what the most important curricular outcomes are, and then I break down those into student-friendly learning targets. So these are the ones for literary studies, and these are the ones for creative writing. You might notice I don't use the I can share my ideas, I can recognize different forms. I frequently tell my students that it's not about what they can do, but what they actually show me. So that's why I don't put the I can do this into my learning targets, but a lot of people do. The learning targets are useful, particularly for students, because they show them what we're working towards in the course. But it's also important that they have more detailed descriptions of what each of these looks like at every stage of proficiency. And this is where success criteria or rubrics come in handy. They're not the same as descriptive feedback, but they do help break down why a student is being assessed at a particular level. And it can be particularly useful for me, the teacher, when I'm looking at the assessment, like the records that I'm keeping for competency-based assessment. These 3 slides are just the rubric that I use for their literary analysis essays. And you can see I start at proficient and I describe that, and then I look at extending, then I look at developing and at emerging. So why do this? Well, there's no question that giving descriptive feedback takes time, but I do it because it has the biggest impact on my students' learning. It's better for me to give descriptive, formative feedback on fewer learning activities than to give grades or even rubrics and grades on more of them. It also can help students focus their attention away from their grade and toward their learning, although around report card time, that grades focus tends to come back. But when we review how the steps of the proficiency scale line up against traditional grades, they realize that they can usually have a pretty good understanding of where they are from that. So this here is based on feedback that I received from 2 of my classes at the midterm. Each term I asked them for feedback to help me improve on my teaching. And one of the questions I ask is, how have I helped you improve in your English skills, knowledge, understanding, and or work habit? And a lot of the responses that I get, including these 4, are based on feedback, on how the feedback that I provide helps them improve. And another question asks about that specifically, and 76% of the students who responded from these 2 classes said that the feedback helps them improve. Assessment for learning isn't something you can learn in a single day from a single video. It involves a lot of practice, a lot of making mistakes, and a lot of trying new things. But that's true about anything worthwhile. What I've shared with you today comes from about 7 years of studying assessment practices and learning how to give feedback, and it's still something I'm working on. I think it's worth the time and effort, though, because I've seen the impact it's had on my learners. We all know the fulfillment of seeing our students grow and develop as learners, and this is a way that you can help accelerate that growth. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you found the information useful for your own learning journey. Please feel free to reach out to me either here or on Twitter.